yourself as a member and ask your question in 30 seconds or less. Now, how do you introduce a hero? A hero to, I think, everyone in this room who is aware of his great accomplishments and that special ability he has to bring diverse backgrounds together and reach common solutions. That's the kind of people who are real heroes in today's world. And Dr. Arias not only has done that, he's been at least partially recognized for it in very outstanding ways, including the Nobel Prize for Peace, and including the fact that he is more than welcome. He is sought after every time a thinking audience gets concerned about where the world is going. I'm not going to give a long introduction because he's the one who doesn't need an introduction. Dr. Arias, we just welcome you here, and we're so proud to be a part of this program. Dr. Arias.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I thank you for inviting me to speak with you today. I am honored to have the opportunity to join a group of individuals marked by their dedication to community service, public affairs, and leadership development. It is only through the examination of society that we are able to discover where we have failed and where we must make changes. As leaders in your communities and members of the City Club of Portland, I applaud you for your efforts and hope that you will continue to make a difference in your city, your state, your country, and our world. Please allow me to make some reflections on the state of our world. In his work, Il problema della guerra e le vie della pace, the eminent Italian philosopher Norberto Bobbio takes Wittgenstein's affirmation that the task of the philosopher is to teach the fly to get out of the bottle. He then elaborates upon it with a series of considerations of the present dilemmas faced by humanity. Bobbio tells us that this image, taken as a global representation of human life, reflects only one of the possible existential situations of man. It is not exactly the most unfavorable situation, for it includes a way out for the trapped insect. Moreover, outside the bottle, the philosopher observes the situation perfectly and is capable of orienting the fly towards the exit. Let us now take this same image as a representation not of the anguish and existential preoccupations of the individual, but of the current predicament in which the human species finds itself. Imprisoned by its own spiritual and moral limitations, as well as the material restrictions imposed upon it by nature, our species can only rely upon itself to come across the road that leads to its liberation. One could make the point that this has been the situation of humanity at all moments of its history, that in spite of the disasters lived through by humanity, it has always found a way out, that as survivors of so many catastrophes of times past, we should be well prepared to survive the catastrophes of the future. I am far from being a pessimist. I admit that, in effect, humanity holds memories of numerous calamities, in the presence of which our survival as a species seems miraculous. However, only an enormous lack of compassion and a great contempt for life would have us evaluate human history as satisfied survivors. In this case, we will be forgetting the part of the human species that has been sacrificed. We will be forgetting the human beings who died in wars of the past, the victims of genocides, those who did not survive childhood due to starvation, the torture on the cross and in slavery, and the innocent civilians who died in the massive, indiscriminate bombings of the modern era. In essence, we would be forgetting all of those who had all of the reasons to believe that humanity would never find the way out. The image of the insect imprisoned in the bottle is especially applicable to our time. Fortunately, however, the mere circumstance of belonging to our era affords us the opportunity to be at once the fly and the observer, to position ourselves within the prison and also be able to observe it from the outside, and even to make the walls disappear. Never before has humanity had such a capacity to know nature and the magnitude of each of its own limitations, weaknesses, possibilities, and strengths. Scientific knowledge, the command of technology, and the maturity of ethical and political ideas allow the human species to set itself up as an observer of its own prison. However, when we act as individuals or as members of groups separated by hatred, mistrust, and egoism, we offer resistance to reason, solidarity, and tolerance. When we do that, we lack the power and will to search for our liberation. During no other time has humanity known as well as now of the location and meaning of its dangers. During no other time has humanity known with so much certainty where to find the resources and knowledge necessary to confront these dangers. However, as much as or more than in the past, human beings continue to resist the ascent of their flight to liberation. Knowledge puts within our reach the tools and power necessary to augment happiness, respect nature, and dignify human life. We should not permit the talent, works, energy, and richness of human beings to be squandered on priorities that defy reason. Such priorities can only be qualified as perversions. Perhaps the most perverse of these priorities is the one that countries, rich and poor, large and small, designate to the preparation for war. The production, trafficking, and accumulation of arms are, for the most part, direct causes of the poverty, inequality, oppression, and environmental degradation that burden us. Even if global military expenditures have decreased in the past 8 years, it is also true that humanity is far from receiving the expected benefits of peace dividends. Too many poor countries continue to spend their limited resources on militaries that serve only to oppress their own people. In the region I come from, two Central American republics, Costa Rica and Panama, as well as two Caribbean island states, Dominica and St. Kitts and Nevis, have constitutionally abolished their armed forces. In Haiti, President Jean-Bertrand Aristide has taken measures to demobilize its army. Currently, many civilian organizations, including the Arias Foundation for Peace and Human Progress, are waging a campaign to promote a constitutional amendment to abolish the army. To many, this may seem to be small accomplishments, but when consulted regarding the armed forces, Panamanians and Haitians strongly favored their abolition. I believe that the eventual elimination of the armed forces might someday be the only way to genuine disarmament. Nevertheless, I understand that the conditions which would permit such an achievement are present only today in a few countries. Without abandoning the dream that our children might someday live in a world without arms, I will be satisfied if at least we can now take significant steps toward global demilitarization. The recent trend in decreased global military spending must not be taken at face value. Since the end of the Cold War, there has been a clear arms surplus, which means that more weapons can be purchased at a lower cost. Today, industrialized countries continue to export death to the developing world. We must end the arms trade, or we will never put an end to violence. This is why I have proposed to my fellow Nobel Peace Laureates to join me in the drafting of an international code of conduct on the arms trade. A code of conduct would stress that any decision to export arms should take into account several factors pertaining to the country of final destination. The recipient country must endorse democracy in terms of free and fair elections, the rule of law, and civilian control over the military and security forces. Its government should not engage in gross violations of internationally recognized human rights, such as in extrajudicial or arbitrary executions, disappearances, torture, prolonged arbitrary imprisonment, and systematic official discrimination on the basis of race, ethnicity, religion, gender, or national origin. The International Code of Conduct on the Arms Trade should not permit arms sales to any country engaged in armed aggression in violation of international law. And finally, the code will require the purchasing country to participate fully in the United Nations Register of Conventional Arms. I sincerely hope that once it is presented, most nations of the world will have the courage, the strength, and vision to adopt the code. It will take time to negotiate such a code, but humanity cannot wait. Poor people in poor nations cannot wait. Our collective future cannot wait. We must take some urgent actions, and we must take them now. In this spirit, let me offer 3 concrete proposals. First, let us give an urgent call to all nations to keep arms out of sub-Saharan Africa. Africa, as you all know, is already disintegrating. It is desperately poor. What sense does it make to keep selling arms for profit to the poor nations of Africa? Let us call on all countries to stop this immoral sale of death and destruction and to immediately stop all arms exports to Africa. Second, as I have already mentioned, we see a promising decline in global arms expenditures. For the first time in our lives, global arms spending has declined from almost $1 trillion in 1987 to $750 billion in 1994. But we are letting this promising peace dividend slip right through our fingers. I have thus proposed the establishment of a global demilitarization fund to be controlled by international jurisdiction, possibly by the UN itself. This fund would be composed of contributions realized through the reduction of global military spending and would permit the world to enjoy the advantages of the peace dividend. The wealthy nations could contribute 1/5 of their savings to the fund, and the developing nations a smaller percentage, perhaps 1/10 of their savings from military budget cuts. And those nations that fail to reduce their military expenditures would contribute a fee or some percentage of their military budgets directly to the fund. Third, let me offer a proposal that may be well ahead of its time. Let the nations that face no real military threats consider abolishing their standing armies and invest in the savings in the education and health of their people. We did this in Costa Rica in 1948, in Panama in 1994, and in Haiti in 1995. This may sound indeed very idealistic, but we are already demonstrating in our Central American Caribbean nations that this can be done, and indeed, it must be done. But arms transfers, my friends, are only one part of the problem. The demobilization and social reintegration of soldiers and the reduction of military budgets and arsenals should also be considered by the international community. Among other things, the United Nations register of conventional arms should be strengthened. As it currently functions, the register is an instrument that contributes to the growth of trust between member states. It can also serve to denounce unusual concentrations of weapons in certain countries or regions. In 1997, the register will be revised. World leaders should realize the importance of taking advantage of this event to extend the scope of the register. Even before this goal is reached globally, governments within particular regions could join together to create more comprehensive regional arms trade registers. None of the goals I have mentioned above will be achieved without leadership. The millennium that awaits us will demand strength, dedication, and sacrifice from its leaders. We must do more than voice disagreement or dissatisfaction. We must actively challenge the status quo. There will be powerful interests threatened by the eradication of poverty, the preservation of the environment, the construction of a true culture of democracy and disarmament. To confront these interests, we need leaders of vision and courage to steer us to a hopeful future with their creativity, sincerity, and resourcefulness. We need leaders not to pander to our whims, nor to tell us what we want to hear. We need leaders concerned with the greater good, who can look beyond personal good, national good, and regional good. We need leaders who can guide us toward a shared responsibility for our collective well-being. 50 years ago, during the Second World War, the United States demonstrated tremendous moral strength in leading the fight for the liberation of Europe. At the end of the war, the United States continued its leadership role in the rebuilding of an entire continent by successfully implementing the Marshall Plan. The United States has and will continue to have an important role in world leadership. The responsibility of the United States, its leaders, and its citizens should not be underestimated. Unfortunately, there are people who would deny and shirk this responsibility, people who believe that the U.S. should care only for itself, but their arguments are self-defeating. In an interdependent world, we cannot afford to look inward only. The United States and the world cannot afford isolationism. If this country is to be a superpower, it must not only be one of economic and military might, it must be one of moral conviction and truly democratic action in the global arena. As a moral and democratic superpower, the United States has the obligation to put its principles before its short-term interests. I believe that one example of this country's failure to do just that is the high level of arms that the U.S. trades to the developing world. Fortunately, this level has decreased since last year. However, this level remains significant, and a large number of these arms are sold to developing nations facing no external threats. Such arms deprive people of food and education if they are not used to repress a people into fear and silence. These arms foster a culture of violence that robs human beings of the benefits of human development. The U.S. has not been playing the role its position demands, a situation that can be seen not only in its arms sales, but in the relatively low levels of foreign aid it offers. This visible lack of solidarity in U.S. foreign policy extends into this country's domestic affairs. If the U.S. spends about 15% of its GNP on its social safety net, this would be less than half the amount spent by some European nations. Those who wish to reduce the level of the social safety net are the same individuals who have been clamoring for further reduction in U.S. foreign aid that presently constitutes a mere 0.12% of the GNP and is almost often channeled to serve geopolitical interests rather than humanitarian needs. This 0.12% is one of the lowest, it is the lowest level of foreign aid offered by any of the industrialized nations. Per capita wise, other industrialized nations spend about 7 times more on foreign assistance than the United States. Even if we believe that the intended reduction of foreign aid should be reallocated to internal social spending, I ask, what difference does it make to spend 15.12, that is to add 15% of the GNP being spent on the social domestic safety net plus 0.12% that is being spent on foreign aid? What difference does it make then to spend 15.12 on the social safety net as opposed to 15%? I believe that the aid offered by the United States is not at all commensurate with its international stature. By maintaining its current level of development assistance, the United States runs the risk of missing a great opportunity, the opportunity to lead other industrialized nations in offering hope in some of the most desperate countries in the world. My friends, as a Costa Rican, having experienced the benefits of living in a country without armed forces, I believe that by globally curtailing arms production and the arms trade and promoting the demobilization of regular and irregular armies, we would be taking a monumental step toward guaranteeing the security of our people and our environment. Disarmament is a fundamental step towards the eradication of poverty, and poverty is the new enemy of humankind. But we should not stop here. Let us ensure that we cultivate leadership capable of generating in a growing number of human beings a new sense of belonging, a sense of belonging to humanity, nature, and the sanctity of life. At a certain point, Norberto Bobbio asked himself if instead of the image of the insect trapped inside a bottle, we would consider other images, such as that of a man inside a labyrinth. He who finds himself inside a labyrinth knows that a way out exists, but does not know which path before his eyes will be the one that leads to the exit. However, the man trapped inside the labyrinth does learn through a series of failed attempts that dead ends exist, paths that will require him to double back and that must not be followed again. Slavery, colonialism, and war have been 3 dead ends in the labyrinth of human history. The path of slavery, followed for many millennia, has already been consciously abandoned by almost every society. In the second half of the century, the path of colonialism was left behind. We must now forego the path of war. Let us begin then without delay to meet this challenge. Thank you very much.
I have a bit of housekeeping here. If Marvin Harrison will come to the front, we have something for him. Dr. Arias, at the beginning of your talk, you mentioned that there were only a few nations who are now able to begin to disarm. How do we instill in other nations the kind of comfort and safety that they will need to begin to disarm themselves?
Well, as I mentioned, there is a trend towards demilitarization in the world. I gave some figures. The world was spending almost $1 trillion in 1987 in the military, and only about $750 billion today. Nevertheless, these peace dividends, as they are called, were mainly used to reduce fiscal deficits, to balance budgets on balancing human lives. What we need is to save some of these peace dividends, and that is why I am proposing the creation of a global demilitarization fund. If I had the funds, if I had the resources to demobilize armies, it would be so easy. It was extremely difficult for me to persuade the Panamanian people that they should get rid of the armed forces. But the main question always is, what do we do with the former soldiers? So if we had the money to retrain them, if we had the money to be able to integrate them into civil society, and these soldiers in Africa, Latin America, and Asia are not West Point graduates. These are peasants who became soldiers suddenly, like the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. I wasn't unable to demilitarize or completely abolish the armed forces in Nicaragua, even though the army is today 1/5 of what it used to be only 5 years ago. But perhaps we could identify countries where there are no territorial conflicts, no border disputes, and be able to persuade them to get rid of the armed forces. In Haiti, there's no army, de facto, there's no army today, but that's not enough. I want the Haitian constitution to be amended so that we can abolish constitutionally the armed forces in Haiti. So the Arias Foundation is inviting 40 legislators this coming week to San Jose, Costa Rica. I expect to share with them our own experience, and they need to go back. They have been recently elected in Haiti. I want them to go back and amend the Constitution so that in 1996, Haiti will join Costa Rica and Panama by becoming a country without arms. So it is not impossible, even though it is not an easy task.
For folks who would like to ask questions, please line up. The microphone is right in the middle of the room, and remember to ask a question. Thanks.
I'm Pete Heuser, a City Club member. Thank you for your thoughts. It's very encouraging to hear some of the progress that's been made. and the promise that your thoughts do offer. But I'm wondering, if we assume, for example, that the United Nations might accept your proposal and might be advocating disarmament among countries, isn't it likely that those countries are likely to say to the UN, all right, we'll disarm, but you need to assure us that you will defend us from an attack? Is that likely to be asked, and should the UN or the US agree to protect those countries?
There has been a reduction in military expenditures of about 3% per annum. But the irony is that the largest reduction has occurred in the industrialized nations, and the smallest reduction in the poorest countries of the world. That's why this code of conduct on the arms trade is so important, because I think it's really criminal to keep selling arms to poor countries, mainly those of Africa. Now, perhaps we could identify countries where there are no military threats. Haiti is one. If Haiti has no army, the Dominican Republic should have no army. If Costa Rica had no army, Panama decided that they don't fear Costa Rica or Colombia or any other country. This should be the case for most Central American countries. If eventually we spend more time on preventive diplomacy, in trying to solve problems before they emerge, it is quite ironic that Sub-Saharan Africa as well as South Asia are spending much more on the military today than a few years ago, the poorest regions in the world. So if we could spend more time trying to solve the conflict between the Pakistanis and the Indians on Kashmir, because that is the excuse the military use to increase their military expenditures. If we can solve the disputes between the Peruvians and the Ecuadorians, well, then there is no use for them to keep on buying arms. And that is true for so many parts of the world, so many regions of the world. Now, we could discuss about the role of the UN in the future, and, well, I'm a strong believer in the UN, even though some people think it is a very inefficient body. I don't think it is. The UN played an extremely important role in my part of the world. It was not easy at that time, and I was still president, to get the UN involved in El Salvador. The US, Washington, didn't want the UN to get involved in El Salvador. During the Cold War, there was a lot of mistrust, is that a word? Mistrust, from the two superpowers. Now, when the Cold War is over, I think we should encourage the UN to do more, strengthen the UN, and mainly be able to rely more on Chapter 6 than in Chapter 7, that is, more in preventive diplomacy. If we are able really to attack the root causes of potential conflicts, then we don't need to send peacekeeping forces to pacify a region. But which are these main threats, challenges? It seems to me that poverty is one, inequality, terrorism, illiteracy, disease. I mean, we are not spending what we should be spending in trying to prevent the conflicts of the future. And poverty, as you are aware, in this country needs no passport to travel. The poor people from Northern Africa will like to travel to Europe. The poor people of South America and Central America and Mexico would like to come to this country. Their dream is coming to this country because everything is going to change the minute they get into this country. So I think it is not because of charity or generosity that we really should look at all these problems if it is true that we live in a more interdependent world. it is because it is in our own interest to alleviate poverty all over the world.
Dr. Arias, the focus of the International Women's Conference in Beijing was on equality, development, and peace. As you know, women are very underrepresented in the Council of Nations. Has your organization, your group of Nobel Peace Prize laureates, considered ways to engage more women in the highest councils of deliberation on these issues?
Well, during my time in office, we passed a legislation on equal rights for men and women in Costa Rica. And it is one of the most advanced legislations in the world. Now what we need is to have the will to implement it. But I'm not the best person to advise you on this. We need to ask the Finnish, the Norwegians, the Swedes, the Dutch. The irony in Norway is that Gro Harlem Brundtland is the prime minister, as you are aware. And the leaders of the two other parties are two ladies, so men cannot choose a man to become prime minister. In most of these countries, in the case of Mrs. Brundtland's cabinet, there are more women than men in her cabinet. In the Finnish parliament, 45% of its members are women. I think it's a matter of education. I have no answer. All I could tell you is that I've been trying to implement this piece of legislation in my own country, and it is extremely difficult. Political parties don't give equal opportunities to women as well as men. It is not true. And culturally, socially, economically, politically, well, there is no such thing as equal opportunities for men and women. There are 1.3 billion people living under the poverty line in the developing world. 70% of them are women. There are 900 million people illiterate in the world. 2/3 of them are women. Well, you know the figures much better than I, so I'm not going to tire you with figures. Yes.
Dr. Arias, let's turn our attention to a country where the external threat is from the United States. Is there a chance of ameliorating the situation between the United States and Cuba?
I'm sorry, the external threat is?
From the United States. In other words, you have spoken about countries having the possibility of not having external threats. In the case of Cuba, the external threat is from the United States. And we could significantly, by changing our policy, make that better. What can be done about that?
Well, I think we need to persuade President Clinton to exercise his leadership concerning Cuba. And if I were President Clinton, I would have vetoed that recent legislation which was passed by your Congress. I don't think the U.S. is a threat to Cuba. No, I don't think you shouldn't care about Cuba. I mean, Cuba is no longer a threat to this country. It used to be, in the sense that Fidel Castro was exporting revolutions in the past. He's been too cynical. He supported the peace plan, the Arias peace plan, and at the same time he was supporting the guerrillas in El Salvador. I have told him personally how cynical he is. But he's no longer a threat. I mean, this is a country that is trying to survive. He's too arrogant not to accept that he has failed, that communism is a real failure. And I was reading the editorial of the New York Times yesterday. It's so anachronistic. You know, it's like a dinosaur. It's something of the past. He still believes he's in 1959. He doesn't realize that we live in 1995 and that everything has changed and he needs to change. I think there is some arrogance both in La Habana as well as in Washington. I mean, there was a need for an embargo in the past if you wanted to punish him. And perhaps he needed to be punished because he was indeed exporting revolutions. But not anymore. If there were no embargo, no one would be thinking in an embargo today. And obviously there is a double standard here, the way you deal with Vietnam and the way you deal with China, you know. You are rewarding the most totalitarian government in history, the Chinese, by investing there, simply because there are 1.2 billion Chinese. And you are forbidden to visit, not to invest, simply to visit Cuba, which is really ridiculous.
I'm Don Sterling, a member. The war in Guatemala seems to keep going on and on between the government forces and some of the peasantry. What is the problem in Guatemala?
So many. Impunity is one of them. You know, they have the most reactionary military in the whole region. And the civilian government is extremely weak. The problem with many of these new democracies or emerging democracies in Latin America is that they are not very solid, that the military is not subordinated to civilian power, just the opposite. And Guatemala is a very good example. The ones who really run that country are the military people, not the civilian president. And they, in the past, have got away with impunity. I'm so glad that this country is putting so much pressure on Guatemala. After all, the peace plan was signed in 1987. We were able to silence the guns in Nicaragua and El Salvador. That is not the case with Guatemala. And I keep meeting with them and I keep telling them, well, the world has changed. What's the use for a guerrilla force in Guatemala? What are you going to accomplish? But for them, for these commandantes, this is a modus vivendi. They don't know what else they can do. And I don't know who the hell is funding them, but they keep traveling from Mexico to Oslo, from Oslo to everywhere, you know, to meet, and the war keeps on and on and on, and it's not an easy problem because you have the Mayan culture there, you have the indigenous people, now you have Rigoberta Menchú, who is a Nobel laureate, and certainly they want also not only to deal with a ceasefire, which would be much easier, but to deal with problems that were not resolved during the last 5 centuries. So it's a rather complicated problem.
Peter Paulson, member of the club. Dr. Arias, how successful have you been in enlisting the support of our global industries, our global communication systems, our oil companies, and so on in the trade? And in regard to the arms trade situation, are you successful at enlisting the help of our global corporations, in other words, in any way?
Global corporation?
Yeah, our global, like in the oil industries, the communications and so on, the corporations of the world, the international corporations.
To be honest and to tell you the truth, I've been dealing mainly with governments. Certainly, the arms trade, demilitarization is not a popular issue. That's why I wanted to talk to you about this issue. Because here in this country, you very seldom read about this topic, about this issue. You very seldom, the media in this country doesn't pick what is not popular. So, you know, for me to persuade Mike Wallace or to persuade Peter Jennings or to ask the New York Times to write about this, it's very difficult. It's extremely difficult. I have tried to write some short articles for the op-ed page of the Washington Post and the New York Times, and they are not interested. So what I do is that every time I have the chance to address to college students, to the young people of this country, as well as other generations like today, I usually do. Now, concerning governments, I've been rather successful. There are some governments, for instance, which are linking now demilitarization to foreign aid. The Dutch, the Scandinavian countries, even the Germans. They are not giving money to those governments which are spending twice as much, 3 times as much, 4 times as much on the military than education and health. So the day the World Bank also includes as a conditionality demilitarization, everything is going to change. All I could tell you is that the developing world is spending almost $150 billion in the military. That is 3 times more what they receive in foreign aid. So a country like Bangladesh receives $1.50 per capita wise from the US. A country like Israel, $170. Which country needs more foreign aid? The answer is very obvious. A country like India receives $7 per capita from US foreign aid, with 350 million living under the poverty line. So my impression is that we need to do something, and the Global Demilitarization Fund would be very useful. If we could really reward those countries in the poor world which are spending less and cutting military expenditures, and punish those other countries which don't want to demilitarize.
Joanne Geddes, City Club member. Many years ago during your presidency, Luis Guillermo Solis, I believe your chief of staff, was here in Portland speaking to many of us, and he talked very specifically about initiatives taking place in Central America that would bring the countries together in an economic type of common market to assist in development. He tied economic development, he tied development in education to peace, and talked about Costa Rica being a leader in all of these areas and looking to work with the presidents and the governments of the other countries as groups in economic initiatives and markets, as well as through education, the development of the Peace University and other initiatives that Costa Rica was doing at the time and could be used as models. Could you update us a little bit on some of those?
Well, during the war in Central America, it was extremely difficult for our economies to develop. Now that the war is over, we have much more trade among the Central American and Caribbean countries. But to be very honest, that's not enough. I think what we need, and it is difficult for such small countries like, well, Costa Rica, El Salvador, etc., but we need export-led growth, just like the Asian countries. And we have many difficulties in that, because we live in a world where people talk about free trade, but no one really wants it. There is a lot of cynicism concerning free trade. You listen to speeches in this country, everybody is in favor of free trade, but We cannot export textiles to this country. We cannot export shoes to this country. We cannot export sugar to this country. And the Europeans are even more protectionist, and the Japanese are even more protectionist. We finished, after 6, 7 years of discussions, debates, the Uruguay round, GATT. Now we have a World Trade Organization. And, well, we'll see what happens. We cannot export our bananas to Europe. So there is a lot of cynicism. There is quite a double standard between what is preached and practiced, what is said and done. Anyway, through free trade, you are not going to solve the problems of Africa. You know, with free trade, Africa is going to be much poorer in the 21st century than today. They really need to, many other things, but they need to cut military expenditures, and they need to spend more on education. They need to educate the children, their children. Again, I mean, it is inconceivable to see poor countries spending twice or 3 times or 4 times more on the military than in education and health. I mean, this is a prescription for eternal poverty. No more. Well, thank you.
Thank you to Dr. Arias. I think we got a wonderful taste today of why this gentleman has received the Nobel Prize in Peace. We'd also like to thank again Bill Weber and Reed College, who helped make this program possible, and we are adjourned.